seem to be connected to each other. That if you have a high standard and you are not easily satisfied, then you will obviously require much harder work and perseverance and patience in order to achieve that standard. Now, why is it that these individuals were in some sense creating a difficult proposition for themselves and then having to work that ensured that they had to work very hard in order to achieve it? Yeah. And this is a question I think we should all really need to ask. Why is it that anybody would create such a difficult proposition for themselves that make them work so hard? And the answer, it turns out, is rather simple. And that's that they're having fun doing that. Okay. The process of these propositions, creation of knowledge in these curiosity or problem-driven contexts, always come with a very rich internal remuneration. Can I solve that problem? If I solve that problem, so many people's life will change. That becomes a major motivator. Design is the motivator, and fun is an essential element of that motivation. Are you enjoying that process? And I've seen that over and over again. Those who have got a taste of designing, they will forever be hooked onto it. But then we are talking about this design. Now, what is design? Now, design starts with something that you don't like. In a more formal way, one would call that an undesired situation. For instance, village folks, their daily chores would require them to walk between 2 to 5 kilometers to the nearest water source. And you might call that undesired, right? It's a long way. The roads are not particularly good. They might be unsafe. The water gets spoiled as you use that for these purposes. It's heavy materials that you are carrying and taking back and so on. And you might set out to improve this, and this transition to a more desired situation is what we will call goal. In order to achieve these goals, you make plans. Depending on who you are, your plans would look different, maybe sketches, maybe drawings. And you hope that if it's implemented and utilized as intended, that the situation will become more desired than it was before. This, for instance, is a rural washing machine that was designed and patented at IISc, where a village woman, would be able to ride it down to the water source. It's a three-wheeler and it's a recliner. Recliner because that way you can get the maximum mechanical advantage from the muscles. And that is compatible with the amount of muscles that ladies would have in their body. And this is a completely natural machine, of course, in the sense that the only human power is utilized for making it, cleaning the washing materials and also carrying it back and forth on the same. Now, this is just one example of how such a device could transform the way in which cleaning happens across the country. Now, what is design? Now, design, the word has two meanings. One is meaning as a noun, a design. And the other is meaning as a verb, to design. So let's look at the first. So that's design as noun. A design is a plan for change. A plan for a system, its implementation, and its utilization for attaining some goal, changing some undesired to some desired. And to design or designing is how such a plan or such a design is developed, right? Please remember that the plan is not only about the solution. The plan is also about what is undesired and what is desired that one is trying to achieve. In other words, the design of both the goal and the means, the plan with which to change the goal. Okay, this is a very interesting departure from our regular problem solving activities, right? We are all familiar with mathematics, for example, right? We are taught algebra and then we are asked to solve some problems, right? X plus 2y equal to something, 3y, 3x plus y equal to something else, find the values of x and y. Okay, so here the problem is given to you and you can't change the problem, right? That's the problem you need to solve. And there are standard techniques that you apply and you solve the problem, and you get often, more often than not, unique answers. Now, design is somewhat different. First of all, the plan may, the goal may change, okay, depending on who you are or what your reasonings are. You might come up with, even if you are given a broad same problem, you might come up with different nuances of the problem. Okay, somebody may say, if for solving this problem, I don't want to create a rural washing machine that makes it easier to go back and forth and clean this. I want to bring the water source much closer, right? Or somebody else may say, no, I don't want to do that. I want to make the roads much stronger. Somebody else might say, well, I want to design clothes that don't require cleaning, right? Or don't require as frequent a cleaning. Somebody else might say, well, I'm going to create a chemical with which I can put it in the water source and the water source doesn't get polluted. So you can change the plan, goal. So, and second is, of course, you can solve it differently. The third is that there are usually not one, but multiple such plans. And I'll come to that in a moment. So designing, therefore, involves, in some sense, both formulating the problem, okay, and solving the problem. And that there is usually not one, but a whole range of solutions. And we need to figure out how these are. So I'll come to that in a moment. So designing is about how design is, and a design is a plan for change. So depending on, therefore, what kind of design you are doing, you might be a technical systems designer, like an engineer who might be designing a power plant. You might be an educator, right? Educational systems designer, such as Maria Montessori, who developed the Montessori method for training children. You might be an aesthetic systems designer, like a logo designer or an advertisement designer. You might be a legal designer, like a lawmaker. You might be a social designer, and so on. Now, I want to take a small departure here, and I want to talk a little bit about some of these examples, right? So here is an example. Okay, before I do that, let me just step back a little and show you something that I think you need to be sensitive to. Just a few slides that I want to use from here. Okay, can you see my slide? The slide says innovation.
No, sir, not yet.
Okay, sorry, then I need to share it, I suppose. Okay. Are you able to see it now?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. So we in order to bring these solutions to the society, we use this thing called innovation cycle. Now, innovation cycle, and I think you've heard the word innovation. It's quite often used these days. And what it means is that how do you find these problems, opportunities in the society, and how we develop solutions and take them down to the society to fulfill those opportunities and solve those problems. Okay. And therefore, the innovation cycle begins at the society and it ends at the society. In fact, it doesn't end. It just continues to rotate, where it goes through this finding problems and opportunities and finding means of fulfillment and solutions and bringing them to the society. Now, what happens there? Well, what happens is that you go through multiple sort of milestones as you move from problem to solution back to the society. The first is that you need to identify opportunities. What is it that people need? You need to develop ideas of how do we come up with what principles should be used to fulfill that need. And then you turn that into product, something concrete that can be implemented. We call that product, right? So, and then you develop a way of implementing that called production. Then you put together a supply chain, somebody who will bring the material, put it together, create this object, take it down to the people that need them. And you create a business around it whereby those that are involved in the supply chain are all happy, economically speaking. Now, what is interesting is that these 6 elements of innovation can also be seen as 6 chasms or valleys of death. So you ask the question, is the opportunity valid in the sense that, is that really an opportunity or problem? Are people ready to pay for it or somebody else for them? Is the idea the most appropriate idea? Is the product the most appropriate way of embodying that idea? Is the production the most appropriate way of implementation? Is the supply chain the most appropriate way in which these materials can be brought together in this life cycle? And is this the most appropriate business model? Right? Now, if we do a very quick back of the envelope calculation, and let's say that the chances of success is 50% in each of these stages, then the overall chance of success is about 1.6%. Right? And no wonder that most innovations fail. In order for it to have a healthy percentage of success, we need to increase the chances of success in each of these stages. So if you take a 95% success rate, for example, for each of these, then you get a healthy 73-74% success. So that's the level at which we operate at the Indian Institute of Science. And that's where I would like you to now come back to the earlier slides. And I'll give you some examples of that. So here is the, just once again. Okay, I hope you're able to see my slides again.
Yes, sir.
Okay, very good. All right, so this is Sickle Innovations. I think it's an innovation startup that was started by 2 of the students at Center for Product Design and Manufacturing, the department with which I'm involved. And these 2 students are Nitin Gupta and Nikhil Mishra. They had a master's project in their final year in the design program at CPDM. And they created a product with which people who are in the fields picking cottons, right, at the time of harvesting, can increase their cotton harvesting productivity. Okay, as you know, probably know that the harvesting time is limited in duration, and not everybody is good at picking cotton. And these people are relatively few and far between as time goes by, because that's something that doesn't give you a good economic advantage throughout the year, right? So, and on top of that, even those who are good at picking cotton are not particularly good at picking cotton. Productivity can be far, far better. And so these students actually took this project upon themselves under the guidance of Professor Diwakar Sen, and they developed this cotton harvesting. It's a handheld device that people can take that can be sort of moved around the cotton pods, and the cotton gets sucked into a chute, and the chute takes it to a bag at the back that they are carrying like a backpack. And basically they can just go around doing that without much ergonomic effort. So they incubated this at MHRD funded Design Innovation Center, DIC, at the Center for Product Design and Manufacturing, of which National Innovation Foundation is also a partner. And they won zillions of awards for this company that they developed, Sickle Innovations. You can look them up. Nitin Gupta started the company. He became one of the top 30 young innovators of the country, was picked up by our Prime Minister. And they were relatively recently were also picked up as the most innovative innovation startup in Agritech by the Ministry of Agriculture. What is it that they did? This is another example. It's Purak. It's an affordable, advanced prosthetic arm. Prosthetic arms are surprisingly difficult to develop and use. Okay. So normally, you therefore see only two kinds of prosthetic arms. Either they are very simple or they are very complex. The very simple ones are usually a prosthetic arm that have got two fingers, and it is epitomized by how good they are at doing something. Well, for most work, they are not particularly good. They are very good at killing people. In James Bond, some of the James Bond movies, the villains have a prosthetic arm with which they can effortlessly kill people by strangling them. But for doing anything more complex than that, okay, imagine that you have 5 fingers and there are multiple joints, and there is a whole area of sensors there, 22 different kinds of sensors or more. With that, we effortlessly pick everything from a flower and a coffee cup to a glass of water, right? Our grips change and the way you hold changes. The question is, how do you replace that for an amputee with a mechanical device that will have at least not comparable, but at least a semblance of comparability in terms of their dexterity? And how do you make that light and cheap, inexpensive, and intuitive, something that people will not require a PhD to understand and use? And that's the challenge that you're up against when you're designing a prosthetic arm. So these two students here, Nikhil Meshram and, not Nikhil Meshram, Nilesh Valke and Vinay, they decided that they would develop that. And this is one of my colleagues who, by the way, lost his forearm, not in an accident in our department, but elsewhere. Until then, he was one of the finest welders that we had in our department, Mr. Ekanathan. So they said, well, how can you bring people like Mr. Ekanathan back to the workforce? And what you see here in the photograph is their first prototype. Anything complex that you design don't work very well first time. That's not failure. That's way of life. So going back to innovation, don't get disheartened by that. Remember the Soichiro Hondas and the Archimedes and so on, that it's just part of the learning process. You learn and you move on. In fact, you can turn it around and use it as a way of making your innovation process faster and more efficient. How can you quickly fail, learn from that, and then try again and quickly fail and learn from that without wasting a lot of money and time? So anyway, they developed this prototype and then they moved on, and it turned out that this is something that uses only a single actuator. Okay, and it uses what is called myomechanical sensing. So basically, it's the squeezing and unsqueezing that changes the stiffness and the girth of the muscles, and one can pick that up as a way of sensing whether we should open the arm and open the fingers and so on. And they use this single actuator in order to create what is called a the prosthetic arm, and then something that most interestingly can be learned within half an hour by somebody untrained, and they could start using it. And so then the Wellcome Trust, which is a global funding body, came and funded this. University of Oxford got interested in partnering with IISc, and they went through another 5 years of development into the second prototype, which is something that is now in the market under a company called Grasp Bionics. Again, you can look up the internet for Grasp Bionics. This has recently been awarded the Elevate Karnataka Award for one of the top innovations and so on. So anyway, why am I showing all this? Because these are all designed by to initiate the master's projects at Center for Product and Manufacturing. Now, IISc, I hope you are all aware of IISc. It's the highest rated university in India. Just recently, I think day before yesterday, the Asia rankings came, and I think IISc was 37th in Asia, and of course top in the country. It's the only Indian university among top 100 in the world. I think only university in India with 75 to 100 ranking within engineering and so on. It has about 40 departments, 400 faculty members, 4,000 students, and it's completely upside down. Most of the students are PhD students, and very few ones are undergraduates. Even though the name says science, it is equally good in engineering. It's one of the only 3 strategic universities outside the US that the Boeing has partnerships, the other 2 being Cambridge in the UK and Tsinghua in China. Center for Product Design is the design and manufacturing phase of IISc. It is also, among the only 3 design schools that are rated and ranked in the QS ranking, which doesn't take into account research portfolio. So it is essentially a teaching ranking. And the other 2 design schools being National Institute of Design and IIT Bombay. In terms of the number of high impact researchers, according to Stanford study, CPDM would be among the top 7 in the world, and certainly the top in Asia in research. Now, what is the vision? The vision is to pursue excellence in education, research, and practice in the areas of design and manufacturing, so that one could support development of systemically complex, which means that you're trying to look at the entire system and solve the problem, rather than allowing to solve the problem in one part so that it shows up in some other part. I'll give an example. If we are not designing for the life cycle cost of a car, for instance, we might make the car very cheap to buy, but very expensive to drive. And that's a systemically complex problem. Second is technologically intensive. The kind of solutions that are created will not shy away from looking at new technologies and exploring them and bringing them together. Very often, disruptive solutions come because we are using something quite different from what is currently being used. And the third is, as Professor Anil Gupta said earlier, the socially impactful solutions. Okay, how do we touch the lives of millions and billions of people, and not only develop something for one individual for his pleasure? And to do that by bringing together not just the functional, but also the aesthetic, the usable, and the sustainable together. Okay, so let's take some examples. First is aesthetic, okay, or semantic. Semantic means meaning, right? How do I convey meaning through form, color, and symbols? Here is a car. Okay, in a normal lecture, I would have asked you to raise your hands. And when I did that, I found that very few people said they like this car. Then I asked about this one, a few more people raised their hands. And when I showed this one, almost all hands were raised. So clearly there is an order in how attractive we can make something. And that plays a very important role in our lives, either knowingly or not knowingly. Okay, we get swayed by how aesthetically pleasant the objects are or the systems are that we are meant to use. It affects our buying decisions, it affects our use decisions, and therefore they are important to be incorporated in line with the functionality of the products and solutions that we develop. The second is human factors, the usability, right? That's a chair. And most would agree that that's not a particularly comfortable, well-supported chair. And then a few more hands would be raised if this was shown, and a lot more hands would be raised when this was shown. Of course, that's a Herman Miller Arion chair. If we look purely from the usability point of view, Third one would be far more usable than the first. However, the amount of materials that is used and the cost and eventual impact on the environment will also be much higher. So here is an interesting question that you can see that there are multiple goals that one has to achieve and not one. And how do you balance these goals to say what is the combination of goals that I should achieve when I'm solving the problems? That's part of your problem formulation, problem finding. This is functionality and feasibility. My personal favorite, Tata Nano. Tata Nano, of course, was not as successful as it should have been. And there are many reasons for that. Let's not go into it. But in terms of something that provides functionality at an incredibly low cost, this is almost unparalleled. During the period that Tata's announced that they would like to have a car on the road that can be sold at less than 1 lakh. In the other countries, it was called a $2,000 car, because those days $1 was 50 rupees. Everybody was astonished, a little bit like the Honda example that I gave earlier. I gave talks in BMW, I gave talks in Munich, I gave talks in the US, in the UK at that period of time. And everybody would come to me and say, okay, tell me one thing. Do you think Tatas can make it? So clearly it created a buzz, okay? A buzz of incredulity and yet curiosity, right? And Tata's delivered. They were able to sell their first cars in less than 1 lakh. And everybody thought that this car will be 2 motorbikes, okay, connected with a plastic cover. Because roughly one motorbike will be about 40K. And then you put a plastic cover another 10K or something. And it will not have any safety. And what did they come up with? It's a side impact safety compliant car by the European standards at that point of time. They, I think, had 37 patents for this and 45 design registrations. So they really thought out of the box in creating this car. Please read more about this. Okay, now all of these things have to come together. It's not solving one problem or the other. It's solving one problem and the other. The problem of functionality, the usability, and the aesthetics have to come together. So here is an example. The reason why these doors go up the way they do is not only for aesthetic pleasure. That is one part of it. The second part is that the survey that the company did found that the people who are buying their car are increasingly of a greater age. Okay, they are middle-aged people. They are beginning to have problems with their knees, and therefore it would be more desirable if they are able to walk into the car rather than slouch into the car. And this allows that to happen, as well as allowing this astonishingly different way of opening the door. And all of this requires a process, okay, a product development, product design process, where, as I said, multiple alternatives have to be juggled. We have the Ford Model T that came, the longitudinal engine. As you know, the engine was placed along the direction of the longer length, okay, of the car, longer dimension of the car. Until only 1950s, you can see at the bottom, 1959, when Alec Isigonis, a British designer, came up with the idea of the Morris Minor Mini, or more commonly called just Mini, okay, where he put the engine in transverse. And here is one of the earliest sketches. Okay, so putting the engine transverse was a relatively recent phenomenon. And why would you put the engine in transverse? Well, you would put it because then the car, the space in the overall dimension of the car goes down dramatically. And yet the amount of space inside doesn't get compromised much. So what you see in the photograph down there is there are 2 cars. One is the original Mini, and the other is the retro Mini retro that BMW has designed more recently. And Alec Isigon is himself standing there at the road that is named after him. Of course, it complicates matters also. Okay, what happens is that when you put the engine transverse, then your transmission has to come perpendicularly and connect to it, and that brings other complications that needs to be solved, of course. So what do we do in design? We do two kinds of things. One is that we synthesize, we come up with new ideas, we expand the space of possibilities. And the second is we analyze, we look at how good they are, we whittle them down and reduce the number. So this expansion and contraction happens when you look at functionality, feasibility, can it be made, can it be implemented, and so on. Usability, can it be handled by humans? Aesthetics, can it be looked at favorably? And typically what happens is that design schools often focuses on the usability and aesthetic aspects, whereas the technical schools would focus on the functionality and usability aspects, but also in a non-homogeneous manner. While design schools should typically focus more on the experiential knowledge of synthesis, try and see if it works, the technical schools will focus more on analysis, saying first find out what's wrong and then see what the wrong can be made right. And therefore major knowledge in synthesis for technical aspects and analysis in usability and aesthetics aspects often do not get integrated. So ideally, we would like to have training in synthesis and analysis for all of these aspects. And that's what, again, Center for Product Design and Manufacturing is trying to do. Here is an example. This is a handheld hair dryer, right? Professor Gurumurthy's class. The students are asked they are given a problem, they are asked to solve it. In this particular year, the problem was, can you design and make a hair dryer that is handheld? That has, this is interesting, that has no heating element. Now, this is one way of crank starting innovation, okay, and creativity. You ensure that the most obvious solution is taken out of the book, right? The moment we say a hair dryer, the first thing comes to mind is heat, and we take it out. The moment you take it out, you have no choice but to think out of the box. Constraint breeds innovation. What did this student, Himanshu Mishra, did? He looked at something that aerospace engineers hate, and these are called vortices. Okay, when air gets spun, and often you will see air spinning. You can see it in the cyclones, for instance, but more easily you can see them when an aircraft takes off. For example, you will see vortices being shed. There are rounds of air. You can see it in water also. In the middle of the river, there may be a portion where the water is spinning around, right? You can see vortices also when you take the plug off a wash basin. You will see the water will swirl around. Okay, what's wrong with that? Well, what's wrong with that is that these are called turbulent motion. Okay, the motion where the energy gets transferred across the layers of the water or fluid, and therefore it loses. Okay, it loses energy. So if you have a wing, aircraft wing that is trying to cut across the air, and if you have turbulence there, these vortices are there, then it basically loses the energy. It doesn't transfer the energy in a smooth manner. And therefore, you end up in spending more energy for the air, for the wing, aircraft wing to cut through the air, or the ship hull to cut through the water than necessary if it were what is called a more streamlined flow of water. So that's why aerospace engineers and even ship designers would hate it. But Himanshu found it very useful. So this is also a lesson here that technology as such is not bad or good. Okay, you should be always open to them. Don't get fixated that this is a bad technology. Friction, for example, is not a good or bad technology. It's just technology or principle. Depending on whether you are trying to walk, friction might be very useful for you, or whether you're trying to design a bearing that I was talking about earlier, but it has to hold something that rotates. And yet itself should not rotate. You want to have as little friction as possible, right? So keep your mind open about technologies. It's not good or bad. It just depends on the application. So what Himanshu said was that, well, if I can let the air linger for longer with the hair, then I should be able to take away, that air should be able to take away more moisture from the hair. So can I create vortices and these lingers on the air for a long period of time and takes away the moisture? So basically what then he created was a vortex generator, right? And here is the rest of the design. So he had a couple of fans that will suck the air in and create vortices, and that vortex will, that air will go out and create vortices in the hair. And this is the analysis part. You can see that is happening after the synthesis. The cycle that I was talking about, and here he is looking at the functionality. And then he is looking at the usability and the aesthetics. How do you hold this? So you hold it in the middle, unlike the other hair dryers that gives you distinction, that you are not just any other hair dryer, you are different. And it also looks stunningly beautiful. So bringing together the aesthetics, the usability, and the functionality. So what do we need to learn in order to innovate? Well, we need to have a mindset for thinking, and that's a little bit what I'm going to talk about in a moment. People, Stanford has made this quite popular. It's called design thinking. But Stanford is not the only institution that speaks about design thinking. The background knowledge for design thinking spans for 50 years before, and multiple design thinking models have been developed. I'm going to talk about the one that IISc has developed. It's a mindset for design-led innovation. Innovation not at the product, okay, but also at the production, the service, and the business, right? So I can design a product to make something better, but I can also focus on the production and say, okay, can I make the production much better? I can also improve the service, and that can be my unique selling point, or I can change the business. Even that could be my selling point. So it's a combination. The second is just the mindset is not enough. You need to have a structured process. Anything complex, imagine you are designing an aircraft. Okay, typically in a company for designing aircraft, large aircraft, they would have between 10 and 20,000 technical people. And they have to come together like a symphony, like an orchestra, right? And work together. Otherwise, this product will not be developed, and certainly not in time, and not in cost, and probably certainly not fly. I wouldn't certainly buy a ticket for that. So you need to have a structured process. You also need to have underlying science and technology building blocks. Now, when I use the word technology and science, I don't mean only for the functional part of it. I also mean it for the usability part of it, the aesthetic part of it. What is the most, what is the science behind beauty? What is the science behind usability and so on? And what are the building blocks that people already have prepared that you can put together, use, modify, change, and so on? And last but not the least, you also need to have knowledge of tools, methods and tools that can make the process faster, cheaper, easier, and so on. A finite element analysis tool, you saw one for fluids a little earlier on the slide from Himanshu Mishra. Right, so I think we have gone through what is design. I'll skip that. So now the important question is, how do you develop such good designs? Okay. First is that, and I hinted at that earlier, that there are multiple goals, not one. There are usually many goals, and some are more important than the other. And there are usually multiple plans. Some plans are better than others. So we can ask 4 questions. How do you identify goals for a particular problem? How do you assess how important these goals are? Otherwise, we cannot judge which ones are more important, and therefore we should focus more on. Third is, how do you generate possible alternative plans? Fourth is how do you assess which ones are better? And fifth is how do you modify these better plans based on this knowledge? Okay. So please remember, multiple goals, some are more important, multiple plans, some are better than the other. And this is where the design thinking process comes in. It is about finding the goals or requirements, evaluating them, generating solutions to satisfy them, evaluating the solutions, modifying the requirements and solutions. And you are not going to be right first time. So this has to happen multiple times because the requirements and solutions are coupled. They are connected to each other. And therefore, finally, you can select the requirements and solutions. And this process goes in cycles, and that's called design thinking. Now, to simplify, we have named them appropriately, call it IISC, where the first I stands for identify. The first two steps, identify, find goals and requirements and evaluate requirements. Second step, ideate, generate solutions to satisfy. Third step, consolidate and evaluate and modify. And fourth step, select. Of course, third step can be select followed by further consolidation. So these two go hand in hand. And so, IISc design thinking is about identify, ideate, select, and consolidate. Here's an example, classroom chair. Let's say we want to redesign our classroom chairs. We ask the questions, what is wrong with the current chairs? Or if nothing is wrong, what can be better? So what's the problem? What problems do you find? Are they uncomfortable? Are they difficult to move? Are they too expensive? So you create, based on that, you identify the directions. You ask the question, what is more important? Is the comfort more important or difficult to move more important? So you find out their relative importance. Then you ideate. How do you support one in sitting? You learn from nature. You learn from existing solutions. You adapt them. Where not possible, you create new ones. Okay. How do you provide holding force comfortably? And here are some examples. How does nature sit? How does hawk sit on rising thermals? These fluids that get heated up, they move up in the air, and these are called thermals. So what the hawks do is that they have temperature sensors, okay, thermal sensors that try and sniff these thermals. When they find one, they go and sit on top of that. So that way they can use buoyancy and stay there for a longer period of time before move on. Fishes actually have buoyancy built into them. They have these puffy little balloons inside that they can move. They can increase the size and ensure that they float. Dust sits using terminal velocity, right? When the velocity is such that the gravity and the velocity friction matches each other. So how do you use any of those to solve your chair problems? Then you select the best possible one and start consolidating, saying, okay, how do you make or simulate, find problems, and then fix them? How do you make legs, for example, strong enough with less material, stability and increasing stability and so on, right? So what these lines that you see on the left side, that is illustrating that if you fold the shape of the chair, of the cross section of the legs, that they will have greater stiffness. And for those who are from mechanical engineering background, will understand that fairly easily, that it increases the second moment of area, and therefore the moment of inertia goes up. So anyway, so you select the appropriate solution and then ask, how do you select that? Because you have these multiple criteria, right? Multiple requirements, but then you also know which ones are more important. So there are multiple ways in which you can then put it together and come to an overall decision. And you go through this cycle multiple times. Now, in order to help students, what IISc has developed is what is called IISc Debuggs. Now, it's a game to play design thinking that we have now patented. And essentially, it's a game with steps that goes through these 4 processes and ensures that school children, for example, can play this game and quickly learn how to carry out design thinking. In fact, we ran 2 workshops with the school children that won the school children's competition that National Innovation Foundation organizes every year, in order to train them and give them exposure to in this process when they were brought to IISc. So identify, ideate, select, and consolidate, and this goes in a kind of Mobius circle. And under each of these stages, so I'm not going to go into these details, okay? This is just a comparison to show that there are multiple stages of the design process that various people have been talking about. Rosenberg and Eccles, you can see on the left side: analysis, synthesis, simulation, evaluation, decision. From 89, Nigel Cross proposed that there is a 7-step process clarifying objectives and so on. There was more development to that. To 2013, a 4-stage process by Paul and Weitz, and further down from Ulrich and Eppinger, another 5-step process. Now, again, you can see that the green ones are problem finding, I talked about, and the blue ones are problem solving. So essentially dividing this into the problem finding and the problem solving part. And then these were simplified by universities like Stanford that spun off IDEO, that made a 3-step process: inspiration, ideation, implementation, and then expanded that further by adding 2 methods to that. One is empathy and the other is prototyping, into a 5-step process. SUTD in Singapore, they came up with design cards like discover, define, develop, deliver. Stanford design thinking became a 5-step model, as I said. And we analyzed all of that. We came to the conclusion that only 4 steps are required, and no less and no more: identify, ideate, consolidate, and select. And this got then espoused, and I'll skip this slide, that these 4 steps are underneath. You can have multiple methods and ways of helping you take the steps. And all of these is a minimum viable product. I'll skip what is minimum viable product. And we created basically a game, right? A kind of a board game. And you play the board game, and these students actually from schools are playing that board game and coming up with new ideas and prototypes and so on. And they actually go out and look at how, for example, coffee is being brewed and what are the difficulties that people face while doing that, and learn from that the problems they basically identify. And then they create a list of requirements, and then they go further down, create their solutions. And I'm not going through this detail. This KV IIS in 2019, the students are developing solutions. National Innovation Foundation in 2019 again. 2018, National Innovation Foundation, and Air Force School in 2017. So kind of going backwards. And the idea is, again, that design is the fountainhead for innovation. And it is the combination of your intuition along with the systematic process that actually enhances and not stifles creativity, and allows you to overcome some of the caveats and the valleys of death that we talked about in the innovation process. And with that, I would like to conclude my talk, and I would like to thank you for your attention. These are some of the papers in international journals and conferences, and the patent application and the design registrations. So thank you. If there are any quick questions, I would be happy to take. Hello.
Students, if you have any questions, you can ask.
Want to ask a question, sir? How the design thinking and the problem identification process differs from India to other countries? Like, it was in my mind, I have never seen UK or other countries, but UK is like having much more development, and as compared to India, India is still developing. So the chances of identification of problems are more in India. So how those countries are identifying problems in their countries and all?
The nature of the problems that are prevailing in each country are different, but the process of finding the problems are very similar.
Yes, sir.
If I can intervene, what Amaresh mentioned at point, was it 3 or 4, the persistence is lacking among our students many times. They don't persist with an idea long enough and they don't destroy their first few ideas fast enough to generate better design. Isn't it, Amaresh?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think this is very important. Don't fall in love with your first idea. This often happens. People fall in love with their first idea and then they get fixated. There is a well-known phenomenon in creativity research. Okay, it's called fixation. Fixation means getting stuck. So the idea is not to follow with one particular idea. Generate as many possible ideas as you can, and then take a dispassionate look as best you can, or ask other people to join you, and together take a hard look at all the ideas and see which ones have the most potential. And even the most potential idea is not necessarily a good idea, and therefore then try and find faults with it and try and fix those. And that finding faults and fixing is very important, because that's what helps you to make the idea more robust. Okay. The second point, perhaps taking on Professor Anil's cue, is that the problem that you're solving is not necessarily your problem, it's somebody else's problem. So rather than putting your opinions about what the problem is, better to observe, better to talk, better to understand where other people are coming from. Okay, the real users of the idea, the real problem owners, as we call them, so that you really solve their problem, not yours. And the other thing you will find is that when you ask people, what is their problem, they will often describe their problem in terms of a solution. They will say, well, what I need really is this. Don't believe that. Okay, they are only trying to express their problem. What you need to do is you need to go behind that solution and say, what is it that is being assumed by the solution, and only take that. That is the problem. So if they say that, well, look, I'm serving tea here, and my problem is that every time there is a spillage of tea, and this is something that is wastage. What I really want is this. I want to have a solution, a tea cup where there is no spillage. Okay. Now don't trust that. I think that you only take the problem. Don't take the solution. Note down the solution. Maybe it's a good one, and you can later on, at the time of ideate, look at it. Right now you are only identifying. Focus on the problem. The problem is spillage. Whether the spillage problem will be solved by creating a spill-proof cup, or whether you are going to provide a direct access to a tap, for example, a tea tap that doesn't allow any water, any tea to fall, is for you to decide when you create these multiple solutions. Okay, so don't get fixated to the ideas, both yours and those that are provided by the users. They're only explaining their problem. Any other questions?
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
Sir, I have a question regarding the research ideas in India and European countries. Leaving some of the good universities, let's say Oxford, Cambridge and all, many of them are more focused on their country basis problems. Whereas in India, we are more precisely focused on what they are doing, and we try to implement in our country also. And so similarly, like because we have a different geographical condition, different people, different communities, we have a different scenario. But we are always trying to put it forward, like what they are doing, let's say people from US, from Europe, and we try to implement in the same fashion. Is it the right way of doing things? First things, my question is this. And second, why are we not focused on more on Indian problems, like problems related to, for a bigger example, is related to water scarcity, air pollution, and all these things. But we are always thinking like, okay, Europeans are doing, should take their idea and we should innovate or in the same fashion only. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I agree with you. I think there is no theirs or ours problems. There are only ours problems. Each problem is touching the lives of various numbers of people. But that doesn't mean that if you have fewer number of people, that the problems are necessarily less important. Therefore, as an academic community worldwide, we need to look at all kinds of problems and not get fixated within national boundaries. And I don't think that even the universities outside India are only focusing on their problems. They're equally interested in our problems, even if it is for the pure and simple reason that there are large markets to be captured by them. So the point is not that if Newton was thinking that let me solve only Europe's problem, Newton's laws probably would not have been discovered. So science and research doesn't typically get bound by boundaries. And I think we better not get fixated to that. Any other questions?
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, there is also the importance of curiosity in this whole thing, that as an academic, I should have complete freedom as to what kind of problems I want to look at. And it is the freedom that breeds creativity. And some problems will have a solution today. Will have an application today. Some solutions will have an application today. Some will take 300 years for it to be applied. Let me give you an example. There was a scientist called Leonhard Euler, EULER. For those who are from mechanical engineering would know his name well, because there are two ways of looking at fluid mechanics problems. One is called Eulerian approach, and the other is called Lagrangian approach, right? One where you follow a particular fluid particle through its history, and the other is you take a controlled volume, okay, within which you see which fluid particles are going in and out. So Euler was a very well-known scientist, and at one point of time there were 7 bridges in a place called Königsberg, and that were connecting multiple parts of that city. And mathematicians were interested in finding out how these land masses were connected by these bridges, such that whether it is possible to traverse each of these bridges once, starting from one particular landmass, and be able to not cross the same bridge twice and be able to come back to the same point again. And they were not able to prove or disprove this, whether it is possible or not mathematically. People tried to walk and they never could manage to do that, but that was not a proof or disproof, right? Of course, this had no particular implication in terms of solving, improving people's lives. This was just a fancy of curiosity. And however, the mathematicians persisted, not just as an individual, but also as a collective. And eventually, Euler was able to crack the problem. What he said was the following. I made a very interesting abstraction here. What he says was that let's assume that each landmass, we'll consider that as a node, and each bridge will consider that as a link. So you can now abstract this particular landmass scenario into a connection of a number of nodes and a number of links, right? And we'll call this a network. So we have a network, and we are looking at a particular property of the network whereby we're starting from a particular node and we would like to see whether we can traverse, okay, these links in order to touch each node only once and yet be able to come back to the node to which we started, from which we started. So he abstracted this into a mathematical problem, and he came up with a number of properties of these kinds of networks, and eventually was able to prove as a relatively simple proof that in this particular case, it is not possible to do this. No practical application, whether European or Indian. But then, a couple of 100 years down the line, today, the fact that you are able to listen to my talk is because of Euler's graph theory, this theory. Why? Because when you take a mobile phone and you are looking for connecting to somebody, making a phone call, what the signals are trying to do is that they are trying to find towers. Okay, what are the towers? There are multiple towers to which I can connect from here to Gujarat or Rajasthan or Calcutta or US. And what is the best combination of paths that together will give me the least cost in terms of time and in terms of the amount of energy that is required? And that is essentially a graph theoretic problem, a network finding problem. When you are making a phone call while you are on a taxi or a car or a train, and you are getting an uninterrupted connectivity, you don't even know that continuously, dynamically, your mobile phone is trying to find new towers as the car moves from one point to another, looking for new connections in this network, right? A complex network, and trying to figure out what's the best connection at this point of time, at this point of space. And that continues to happen. And you don't even realize this complex activity is going on at the background in order to give you an uninterrupted phone call. All that because some stupid mathematicians were 200 years ago trying to figure out whether the 7 bridges of Königsberg connect in a certain way. So it's very important that you have your freedom as an academic to pursue any problem that you take your fancy on. Any other last question?
Sir, any few tips for our project planning, sir?
I think tips are not a good idea. You should start reading. Okay, please start reading background materials, prepare yourself. Okay, shortcuts are not the best way to prepare.
Before you go away, Amaresh, I have a request to make. We will have our last session on June 16th. So please look up your calendar, and if you will have little time, then you could look at the presentations of what these kids have done. I can send you a list, and if you can choose that, okay, I would like to listen to these, if you don't have time for all of them, then we will accordingly schedule their presentation to get your feedback to what they have done and whether they have followed your advice, which is you have given many very, very practical, but also very conceptually framed advice about how should one go about solving problems and not getting stuck at fancy ideas that occur early in the train of thoughts. So would you have some time on June 16th or 17th? 17th is ideal. 17th is the last date. June 16th is the day before. So we can adjust on either of the day when you are convenient.
Okay, so let me come back on that.
Yes, I will send you a mail.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Amaresh, for a wonderful chat. And all of us have learned a lot. And this idea about how the conceptual thinking can have applications even 200 years down the line is a very good example of ability to develop abstract thinking, because very often the young people get into the concrete, get into practical very fast and leave aside the more painful part of conceptual abstraction. So I think you have made a very good point towards the end that don't jump onto the solution too early. Look at the root of the problem and conceptualize it. Thank you so much, Amaresh. We are grateful for your time.
Thank you. And I'm grateful for this opportunity to share my ideas with the young minds. I hope it helps somebody.
Sure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.